The call came to me from a voice so true. Down by the river where the waterers move. A gathering of freed families in Arkansas. By the year 1885, small but determined communities of freed black families who had survived the nightmare of slavery called Arkansas home. With their own hands, these men and women near Pine Bluff and Helena built wooden cabins, planted cotton, corn, and sweet potatoes, and organized schools inside abandoned churches. They held to the belief that their freedom could finally mean a chance to live with dignity, even though the Civil War had ended 20 years earlier. At sunrise, fathers worked the soil, while mothers tended vegetable gardens and taught children the alphabet using broken slates and chalk. Strong was the community spirit, with Saturday gatherings filled with music, prayer, and hopes for a future that no one could take away. Yet in this time, freedom was fragile. Often, armed white patrols passed near their land, and whispers of violence traveled from county to county. Tightly, the families held on to one another, knowing their only defense was unity. At this moment, the community stood at a crossroads between hope and danger. Unaware that their lives were about to be shattered once more, they faced emerging threats from white landowners. While freed families dreamed of independence, many white landowners in Arkansas were determined to restore the old order. Plantation owners and former Confederates who once commanded enslaved labor now faced fields without the free workforce they had depended on for generations. Each season, their resentment grew as they watched black farmers selling crops in town markets and buying small plots of land. By 1885, groups of angry whites began holding secret meetings, plotting how to reclaim control. They spread rumors that freed men were dangerous or lazy, poisoning public opinion to justify violence. Sharecropping contracts were already designed to trap black families in endless debt. But for the most ruthless landowners, even that was not enough. They wanted complete domination, the same forced labor that had made their fathers rich before the war. Some organized bands of riders dressed in plain clothes who patrolled the countryside to threaten and intimidate anyone who resisted. The freed families knew the danger but could not imagine the scale of the betrayal that was coming. Heavy with tension was the air in Arkansas as two visions of the South, freedom and slavery, collided once more on the same soil. False promises of employment. By the summer of 1885, life for freed black families in Arkansas was already full of hardship. Yet their most valuable possession remained hope. Into this fragile hope stepped men who claimed to be recruiters. With confident smiles and words that sounded trustworthy, they rode into communities near Little Rock, Pine Bluff, and small farming towns. They promised safe housing, steady wages, and the chance to work on prosperous farms or railroad projects that needed honest labor. To families struggling to sell crops at fair prices or pay off unfair debts, these offers sounded like salvation. Often, the recruiters carried papers stamped with false signatures, pretending to represent companies in Memphis or St. Louis. They spoke of opportunities that would allow parents to feed their children and even save enough money to buy more land. Worn down by poverty, men and women believed in the chance of dignity through work. They gathered their few belongings, trusting these promises of a better life. But behind the kind words was a carefully laid trap. The recruiters were not offering jobs. They were agents for landowners who wanted to restore slavery under another name. Willingly, the families walked into danger, not knowing that soon their freedom would vanish. Ambush and capture. The journey that began with hope turned quickly into terror. As wagons carried men, women, and even children toward supposed new farms, the tone shifted. Outside the towns, far from the eyes of neighbors, the recruiters revealed their true faces. On horseback, armed men appeared, surrounding the travelers. Rifles were pointed at fathers who dared to question what was happening. From burlap sacks, iron shackles were pulled, and chains clanged as wrists and ankles were locked once more. Screams filled the air as mothers tried to shield their children, but resistance was crushed with whips and the threat of bullets. In the forests of rural Arkansas, the nightmare of bondage returned, hidden from the outside world. Now stood helpless, bound and broken, those who had once celebrated freedom after the war. Realizing the trap had been sprung, the captors forced them onto wagons, not as workers, but as property. Every mile driven deeper into isolation was another mile away from the dream of independence. Into their hearts settled fear as they understood that the promises, the papers, and the law meant nothing. In that moment, freedom in Arkansas became an illusion, and the shadow of slavery reclaimed its victims. Transport to remote plantations. After the capture, the families were forced onto rough wooden wagons. Along muddy Arkansas roads, the wheels creaked, carrying human lives deeper into isolation. Far from towns like Pine Bluff and Little Rock, the captors chose routes, avoiding places where someone might ask questions. The journey was long, often taking days, with only short stops at riversides where captives were given scraps of cornbread or dirty water. Their own wrists bleeding from iron chains, mothers tried to comfort their crying children, whispering lullabies. In silence, fathers sat, their eyes fixed on the horizon, powerless to protect their families. The farther the wagons traveled, the more hopeless the situation became. From open farmlands to thick forests and swamps, the land changed, natural barriers that kept the captives trapped in both spirit and body. The overseers laughed, drinking whiskey as they cracked whips in the air, reminding everyone that resistance meant death. Hoping one day to escape, some tried to memorize landmarks. But designed to erase all paths to freedom was the isolation of Arkansas's countryside. Finally, the wagons stopped at hidden plantations, properties owned by men determined to keep slavery alive despite laws that declared it illegal. Here, away from the reach of church networks or newspapers, the captives were unloaded like animals, their dignity stripped away, their names ignored. For them, the journey ended, but the nightmare had only just begun. Life under forced labor. Before we continue with our story, if you're enjoying it, don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you won't miss the next real stories about slavery. Let's continue. Once on the plantations, the daily rhythm of captivity began with the rising sun. At dawn, the shouting of overseers or the sound of a whip against wood dragged men, women, and children into the fields. Endlessly across the land stretched cotton rows, and the work was backbreaking. Under the hot Arkansas sun, hands became raw and blistered from plucking sharp bolls of cotton. Sacks that weighed nearly as much as their own bodies were carried by children as young as 10. Pregnant women were not spared, forced to bend and pull until exhaustion dropped them to the ground. Scarce was the food, usually little more than cornmeal, molasses, or beans served at night after hours of labor. Limited were water breaks, and those who slowed down risked a beating. Rifles and whips were carried by overseers, reminding the captives with every gesture that their lives had no value beyond the work they could perform. Nights brought no rest. On dirt floors, captives slept in shacks made of rotten wood, crowded together. The air filled with the smell of sweat, blood, and despair. Yet, even in these unbearable conditions, there were signs of resilience. In hushed voices, prayers were spoken, songs were whispered, and elders told stories of freedom to keep hope alive. Another day of suffering meant every sunrise, but also another chance to imagine survival. Prisons where slavery was reborn became these plantations, hidden deep within Arkansas, proving that for many, freedom was still a distant dream. Resistance and secret appeals. Even in the darkness of forced bondage, the human spirit searched for ways to resist. Among the captives on those Arkansas plantations were men and women who remembered stories of churches that had once hidden fugitives and of the Underground Railroad. At night, after the overseers drank themselves into sleep, quiet whispers carried from shack to shack. Some spoke of escape, tracing possible routes in the dirt with sticks, memorizing the position of stars and marking trees with hidden symbols. To avoid drawing suspicion, mothers hushed their children, while fathers promised that freedom was still possible. Through traveling black preachers who visited rural communities under the guise of holding prayer meetings, messages sometimes reached the outside world. These preachers, carrying worn Bibles and strong voices, listened carefully to the whispered accounts of captivity. When they left, they carried more than sermons. They carried news of hidden slavery to sympathetic churches in towns like Little Rock or Memphis. Written in secret were letters, hidden beneath clothing or disguised in prayer books, appealing for help from those who still fought for justice. But resistance came at a cost. Savagely beaten was anyone caught plotting, sometimes chained to posts as a warning to others. Still, the seed of defiance could not be destroyed. The captives knew that silence meant death of the soul, while resistance kept hope alive. With every whispered plan and every message carried beyond the plantation, the truth of their suffering in Arkansas slowly began to move toward exposure. Exposure of the crime, the truth of illegal bondage in Arkansas did not remain hidden forever. By the late months of 1885, fragments of testimony reached black newspapers in Memphis, Nashville, and Little Rock. Concrete accounts of families captured, chained, and forced into fields were finally had by editors who had long warned of slavery by another name. Small articles began to circulate, shocking freed communities who thought such horrors belonged only to the past. Vital in spreading the word became church networks. Fiery sermons were preached by ministers, calling the abuse a betrayal of God's promise and of the nation's laws. In prayer meetings, names of missing men and women were spoken aloud, their absence a painful reminder that freedom was not yet secure. For escapees who managed to flee, women's aid societies began gathering food and clothes. However, white authorities dismissed the reports as exaggerations. Local sheriffs, often tied by blood or business to the landowners, denied everything. Yet, louder grew the noise of truth. A few brave journalists traveled near the plantations, speaking quietly to those who had escaped and writing stories that described in chilling detail the chains, whips, and endless rows of cotton. Across the South spread these publications, stirring outrage among freed people and allies who had fought in the Union Army only 2 decades earlier. More than an article became the exposure of the crime. It became a cry of warning. Forced to confront a terrifying fact was the world: slavery had not truly died in Arkansas. It had only changed shape, hiding in the shadows, waiting to be revealed. Confrontation with authorities. As reports of illegal slavery spread, pressure mounted on state officials in Arkansas to act. Demanding investigations, black communities in Little Rock and Pine Bluff organized petitions. Directly to the governor's office, church leaders carried testimonies from the countryside, insisting that justice could not be delayed. For many freed families, this was a test of whether the law truly protected them or only served the powerful. When authorities finally sent sheriffs to inspect the plantations, the visits were little more than theater. Often friends or business partners of the landowners, local lawmen claimed they found no evidence of abuse. As workers under contract, they described the captives, hiding the truth behind legal words. With guns aimed at them from behind, families still in chains were instructed to remain silent. Fear silenced many, but a few brave voices tried to speak only to be shouted down. The confrontation reached courtrooms where testimonies from black witnesses were dismissed as unreliable by judges sympathetic to white landowners. To maintain power, the law written to appear neutral was twisted. That the system itself was designed to protect those who profited from their labor was realized by freed people. Still, the issue was kept alive by the persistence of activists, preachers, and journalists. Even in the face of cover-ups and lies, the struggle revealed the deep cracks in justice, exposing how fragile freedom remained for black families in Arkansas during 1885. Legacy of fear and memory. Although some captives managed to escape the hidden plantations, many never returned to their communities. Once again, families were torn apart, with mothers left to wonder if their husbands or sons still lived somewhere in bondage. Deep ran the memory of betrayal, carried in the stories whispered from generation to generation. In Arkansas, freedom came to mean survival rather than true independence. Now carrying silence and caution were communities that once gathered with songs and hope. Their children were taught by parents never to trust strangers offering work, warning that chains could hide behind a friendly voice. The scars of 1885 remained, both emotional and physical. Even decades later, the sound of wagon wheels rolling into the forest, taking loved ones away forever, was recalled by elders. Yet these painful memories also built resilience. Stronger centers of protection became churches. About dignity and vigilance, schools taught children, and injustice continued to be exposed by newspapers. Part of a larger truth became the story of the freed community recaptured and forced back into bondage, that slavery had not ended cleanly with the Civil War, but had lingered in shadows, taking new forms. The identity of black families in Arkansas and beyond was shaped by this legacy. Their suffering was not forgotten. It was transformed into a lesson of survival, courage, and the unbreakable will to fight for real freedom. The echoes of 1885 remind us that liberty, once stolen, must be guarded fiercely. For history has shown how quickly it can be taken away.